Hello, and welcome to the Fear Channel, a channel with regular broadcasts telling the most chilling of urban legends, ghost stories, and forays into the darkest corners of the human mind. Those faint of heart or prone to night terrors should proceed at their own risk. Tonight's story is Werewolves.
My uncle's a good man. He's a working guy. Had no college because he was in the military and then really messed up with drugs. He quit the day he had his first kid though, and he's been clean as a whistle ever since. He's gruff, occasionally to the point of being an ass, but he's good at heart. So he quits drugs, like I said, and he does contracting work for a solid 30 years to support his kids. Invests his retirement fund into a can't-miss company his old friend recommends, supposedly on the back of insider information. But the company goes under, and my uncle, who has sold his own very small business, is back to square one, at age 60. So he buys a big-ass cargo van and takes to the road, driving loads of whatever anyone needs moved to anywhere they need it moved to. These are his stories, not mine. So my uncle has been on the road for a few months at this point. He's made enough money to upgrade his van, and he's got a decent little setup in it. Turns out you could buy vans that have little cots that fit nicely into the ceiling of the vehicle, and if there's room in his load, he can just take the cot down and sleep in the back to save money on hotels. So he's rushed delivering a load of bolts from this wholesaler in Indiana to a tool and die shop in North Carolina. He wasn't even going to take the job. He'd already driven 10 hours that day, and you're supposed to not exceed a certain number of hours in a given period. But he's a private contractor and nobody regulates anything he does. Besides, rush deliveries pay very nicely, especially when there's a motivated buyer at the far end of the run. So he maps out a 9-hour route southeast through Kentucky and Tennessee into North Carolina, and leaves at 6:30 p.m. The load needs to be in at 8 a.m., an hour before the opening of business the next day. This means he has 12.5 hours to make a 9-hour trip. He loses 1 hour going from Central Time to Eastern Time. So he loads up on coffee and gas and takes off like a bat out of hell. It's hard driving at dusk through unfamiliar states, especially as you get up into the Appalachians. He starts to nod, despite the coffee, and he approaches the Tennessee-North Carolina border. He's about 5 hours in at this point, and he decides to pull over in the middle of nowhere up in the mountains. Right now it's pitch black out. He takes a random exit, since he can't find any rest stops, and he pulls off the freeway with no signs for gas stations, restaurants, nothing. At the end of the on-ramp is a stop sign and a long, straight, old-ass road stretching off in both directions. My uncle turns right and tries to find a business or something to park in and catch a few winks. There is nothing anywhere. He finally sees a little gravel road peeling off the main road after approximately 5 miles of nothing. He pulls over, parks the car, and gets outside. It's warm and wet out, being that it's the middle of summer and all, even though he's in the mountains. The bugs are incredibly loud. My uncle yanks open the back of the van, climbs up, and takes down his cot off the top of the boxes. He sets up, closes the door, locks it, and settles in for 2 hours of sleep before he starts again. And sets 3 alarms, as always, and actually gets some rest, for maybe half an hour. That's when he hears this massive thump. He wakes up. The bugs are silent. His heart is going crazy and he's worried he was dreaming, so he tries to steady his breath. Then there's another massive thump. Something smashing into the side of his van. There's a loud, piercing scream from outside. Now the van can't be unlocked from the outside, but he also can't get into the front of the van from the back. There's a wall between the seats at the back end. So my uncle's out in the middle of nowhere, in the mountains, when something's screaming and slamming into the van, in the middle of the night, with no cell service and no way to get out of there without going outside. He's trying to think what he can do, and trying not to panic. He's up in the mountains, and all of a sudden he's worried that whatever's out there is trying to push him off a cliff or something. It screams again. He has no gun, just a large pocket knife and a tire iron. That's when he has an idea. He takes his keys and hits the alarm button. The van starts going insane, and whatever's out there does not like it. It starts smashing into the van wildly. Then it screams, "I know you're in there! Come the fuck out!" Oh great, it's probably some random hillbilly hopped up on meth. Whatever's out there smashes into the driver's side window and starts frantically rummaging through my uncle's stuff. This is when my uncle hears his opportunity. So he grabs the tire iron in one hand and holds the knife closed in the other. He flings open the back end of the truck and sprints around the van. By the flashing alarm lights, my uncle sees that the meth head is completely naked and covered in possibly his own blood? The meth head charges at him. He sidesteps and whips the tire iron right into the guy's skull. The hobo crumples to the ground. My uncle frantically races back, closes the back door, hops in the van, and drives straight through to the delivery site in North Carolina, leaving the meth head in a heap on that dirt road. He was too wired to sleep for days afterward, and stayed in hotels for a while after that, even after his window was repaired, and in spite of the expense. There was no car, bike, or any evidence that the meth head got to the van except by walking. My uncle claims that he scoured Google News for reports of a dead man found out there for months, but none ever came in. So God only knows whatever happened to that guy. My uncle bought a gun before leaving North Carolina. But this is far from his only story. My uncle, as we've established, is clean, and has been for a long time. He's a hard worker, he's desperate for cash, and he's got a good van. He doesn't make excuses, and he doesn't get pulled over driving loads of junk he hasn't weighed. All this means that my uncle is a very in-demand man. And what's more, it means that he ends up doing a lot of high-leverage jobs that need to be done quickly and correctly, and as such, jobs that pay very, very well. Our second story begins with my uncle being asked to do just such a job. A good, trustworthy dispatcher has a client who needs a ton of parts delivered to his business in Flagstaff for an order that needs to be assembled and sent off ASAP. They need the parts by tomorrow. Problem is, my uncle is in Denver, and that's an 11-hour drive through hard mountains and desert. Making matters worse, the load is technically too heavy for his van. But the client is desperate, however, and the dispatcher is willing to pay a ludicrous amount of money to get these things there on time. I'm talking $3,000 for 11 hours of work, with gas paid for. Most of the drive is uneventful, though a cop does pull alongside my uncle in Utah and eye him suspiciously before peeling off to pull over a speeder. My uncle heads south through the Navajo Nation, just as the sun begins to set. This is his first time in the nation, and he's going in with the darkness. It's creepy out there, in the middle of nowhere, so my uncle says. He happens to get just the most beautiful night, stars as far as the eye can see, and he feels like his van could just lift right off that old-ass highway and float through them. He's passing the time pleasantly enough, thinking back to time spent in the Midwest, when something catches the corner of his eye. There are black blurs flitting along the very edge of his brights, off to the left and way far ahead. He turns his head as he drives past, but of course he can't see anything, since it's dark as hell. But the shapes persist. He rubs his eyes, shakes his head, and tries to refocus on the road. But they're still there. He's gone several miles now, but the shapes are staying in front of him. He wonders if there's something wrong with his headlights. Maybe there's a dead bug on one of them. Then there's a long, flat patch of desert, illuminated by the moon, and he gets his first good look at whatever's out there. Wolves? Maybe a quarter mile directly to the left of his car? Nah, one wolf, running weirdly. But keeping up with him? As soon as he thinks this, the wolf starts to lag behind a bit, and he has to deliberately remind himself to pay attention to the road so that he doesn't veer off of it. But when he checks back, the wolf is still lingering, still a quarter mile off, still shuffling weirdly, about perpendicular to his blind spot. He's losing it, he decides. No way, right? But the wolf keeps going, and then something happens, my uncle says, which he will never forget. He doesn't like to tell this story, or any story really. He's a quiet dude, and in fact only told me after we had seen one another for the first time in over a year, and after we had been up all night at a family event. But he swears it's true. Disturbed, he checks for cops, and bumps his van up to 80 miles per hour, trying to leave this weird-ass cheetah wolf behind. For a second, it seems like the wolf is fully behind him, and he's satisfied. But then, the hair on the back of his neck stands up, and he breaks out in a cold sweat. Something twitches in the corner of his eye. He looks over his shoulder. It's the wolf. It's keeping up with him again. Only this time it's running on its hind legs. My uncle does a double take, eyes bugging out of his head, and floors it. Then the wolf takes an angle of pursuit. My uncle's frantically looking over his shoulder now and back at the speedometer, hardly glancing at the road. The wolf is drawing closer, even as my uncle pushes the pedal down. Before too long, the wolf is running on the edge of the road. Then slowly it starts to veer across the other lane. About a mile ahead, my uncle sees two big headlights barreling down the opposite lane. He decides he's going to do everything in his power to make sure that the semi hits the fucking wolf, because he's in a full-on adrenaline-fueled panic. Right now he is gulping, sweating so badly his hands are slipping on the wheel, breathing loudly through his mouth. The wolf keeps inching closer. Finally, my uncle flat out floors it with everything he's got. The engine whines, straining against the heavy load. The semi barrels toward them, and in the instant before the semi hits the wolf, blaring its horn as loudly as it can, the wolf is right next to my uncle's driver's side window. I've never heard Bill lie before. This is what he says happened. I don't know what to believe. It presses its body flat against the car, and it stretches into a black shadow. Eventually, he swears, it takes on a humanoid form with exaggerated facial features that it presses against the window. As the semi blazes past, it smashes its huge eyes in a Cheshire Cat grin flat against the window, to the point where it fogs up on the outside. He can't tear his eyes from its eyes. It's the most malicious smile he's ever seen, and something feels wrong, icy cold in his very core. Once the semi is past, the thing leaps away, shrieking with ear-splitting laughter and perching on a nearby rock. My uncle can hardly breathe, and he vomits into the seat next to him and continues to floor it. The thing stays behind, screaming and gasping with laughter. He makes it to the drop, still cold and nauseous. He can't look the client in the eye. He smells like vomit, and he tells the client the story. Again, Bill's a very quiet and very private dude. He must have been shaken to say anything about this to a stranger. The client is certain that he's drunk, and my uncle never delivers for him or drives through the Navajo Nation again. At the urging of one of the workers at the client's warehouse, my uncle goes to see a Navajo medicine man in the area, who brushes him with feathers and gives him a blessing. My uncle pukes again, and afterwards feels right as rain.